So Walter, I'm going to call on you first, and I would like you to tell us about the origin of this book and the project behind it, and this concept of bridging two seemingly disparate worlds.
My wife, Charlene, and I went to Fourth Presbyterian Church. We're still members there. We've moved out of Chicago recently, but for 10 years, we were members there. It's on what's called the Mag Mile, the Magnificent Mile, Michigan Avenue, about 800 North Michigan Avenue. And after church in this large neo-Gothic cathedral with a large congregation and a rather traditional worship, we would walk south on Michigan Avenue and have lunch at the Renzo Piano, which is the top floor dining room above the modern wing. And then we'd spend the afternoon, most enjoyable afternoons, walking through the Art Institute of Chicago. And increasingly, we found ourselves walking more and more through the modern wing, which, as you have just said, holds their amazing collection of modern art. So I felt like I was moving from one world to another, and to get to the Art Institute, you have to cross the Chicago River on the DeSable Bridge. And it began to impress me that we were crossing a bridge into a different world, but we don't leave God, and God doesn't leave us, and God is here in church, and God is here in the modern wing, and we're meeting God in church, and we're meeting God in the modern wing. And in what way are we meeting God, and how is God speaking here? And who are these artists that are made in the image of God and are makers and are speaking through their art? And so these kinds of thoughts increased in my mind and heart. And in 2015, made the proposal to our adult education committee, how about having some artists, art historians, art theologians come and speaking to the church about art in the modern wing. And so that became the beginning of a series of 10 presentations over 3 years. And Cam, thanks be to God, came along my side and was my coach and mentor and a wise counselor. And so we started this series, God in the Modern Wing, as a way of understanding that we don't leave God's presence when we leave church, and God is speaking actively through these artists. What do we have to learn from them, and how do we hear God's voice in the modern wing? Certainly we are impressed upon us that God is speaking through the hymns and the message and communion in church, but it's a bit more of a challenge to know how to listen, how to see, how to understand modern art as the avenue by which God also is speaking here. So that's the origin.
And I liked immediately the way Walter's story of this kind of pilgrimage from Sunday morning to Sunday afternoon across the bridge disrupted this binary that I think is so easy to adopt. In other words, we knew for sure, and I've worshiped with Walter and Darlene in their church, that you know for sure when you're there that you're in a sacred space. But then you step out and go to the art museum, and you're kind of raised in my background, the way I was raised, you're in a secular space, or, well, we've gone from a holy place to an unholy place. And yet Walter's talking about having experiences that are spiritual and significant. So an interesting project. And so as Walter said, had this lecture series in November of 2015, and it was a success, repeated it in 2016, 2017, and each of our speakers located an important artist in the modern wing or important bodies of work and gave their Sunday morning lectures based on that. And that became the book.
Right. So each of those presenters over those years essentially turns a lecture into a chapter in this book, including images of the particular pieces, or at least some of the pieces that they chose to write about in the book. Let me ask you, Cam, you, in the introduction to the book, you give a little bit of an overview of modernism as a period, both in the intellectual world of ideas and also particularly in the visual arts and the so-called art world. Why is modern art so-called often difficult, even for those who appreciate art, say the Impressionists, who appreciate art in general, but especially difficult for persons of faith and particularly Christian faith? What is it about modern art that is challenging?
Well, there's a lot to say on the topic, but I think the most obvious thing at first is so much modern art deals with abstraction. So we're more familiar with, art from the Renaissance, and we're more familiar with art that tells stories and has recognizable figures and is trying to recount a narrative, say, or just depict some realistic picture of life, right? A still life, a landscape, something like that. And so modern art has a different kind of vocabulary that it engages in. And part of that turn is something I write about in the introduction to this book. And I use Monet, the Impressionist, as an example, who late in his career just became enamored of the process just of painting, of putting paint on the palette and manipulating it, scumbling the paint on canvas, and just got caught up in that very direct and primary action of mixing color, moving paint around, and having a direct encounter with the creative experience. He was painting the water lilies, of course, but increasingly in abstraction. So I think that's one of the reasons that modern art is difficult for some people. Also, we have to consider the period in which the work was painted. And so if we're not, or sculpted or created, and if we're not thinking about the world as it was or when this work was made, then it sometimes is difficult to grab hold of the themes. But I'll just make a point here that late in the modern period, in modernism, which sort of comes to an end around the 50s or 60s, World War II and World War II figured very prominently in the mind of artists. The existential angst, the tremendous violence in the world, man's inhumanity to man, the place of technology in warfare. And so there was a lot of darkness and a very palpable sense of evil at loose in the world. And so some of this art is responding to that existential moment.
And Walter, how about you? How did you come to appreciate modern art from that period?
Primarily through friends. I have a wonderful creation of art by Cam Anderson called Order in the Firmament, which is basically abstract art. You couldn't immediately know what it's about. I wish I could show it to you. I have a large painting by Mako Fujimaro, Soliloquy of Joy. I have 4 or 5 pieces of art by Bruce Herman, which are abstract art. I have art by Tony Askew, who's a very dear friend of mine, a great artist, and does mono prints, and it's all abstract art. And so I grow in friendships and grow in my appreciation of their art, and they lead me on, or I hope not lead me astray. But it's somewhat of an acquired taste. I think it is not something that I haven't entered into easily or quickly. I've learned from these friends, and then I have, you can't see it here, but a whole library of books on primarily modern art and all kinds of abstract expressionism and so on. And it's become my favorite kind of art to look at because it isn't so easily understood. It requires time and thought, and it's not just all there on the surface. You can't look and say, what a beautiful face, what a beautiful tree. You have to say, what is that?
Right.
What's happening here? And I like that. It's the old thing of tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And I like the challenge of modern art to make me think and struggle. I like the way it disturbs me and disturbs those with me that I'm looking at it, trying to understand it. So that's
Good.
basically.
I might add too, this is not entirely different than many of the disciplines probably of the other folks who are on this call, right? So you move into these disciplines and give your lives to them. And if you were to give us, the 15-second speech on what it is that you do in your laboratory, say, or when you're writing code for computer, well, it would take a little bit for us to tease that out of you, but eventually you could communicate with us what it is you're thinking about doing, and it would be equally fascinating, frankly. So I think this is also the nature of the disciplines.
So Walter, in your preface to the book, you mentioned some of the pieces that are meaningful to you in the modern wing at the Art Institute, one of which is Giacometti's sculpture called Walking Man 2. And your sentence is, Giacometti's Walking Man 2 from 1960 makes me cringe. Makes me cringe. So comment about that piece, and then I'm going to turn to Cam, who unpacks it in his chapter.
I wish you could put an image of Walking Man. It's a large figure, but almost a vanishing figure because it's so pinched and almost not there. The legs and the arms and the face, the whole torso. There we go. That's it.
A little glimpse. I'll give you a little glimpse from the book.
And I have many photos of myself and or family or friends standing next to it. And usually I say, you are dust, to the dust you shall return. This Walking Man makes me think of the frailty, the fragility of life, makes me realize how vulnerable we are. And then what really comes to me is that the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. Jesus walked among us, and Jesus, with all of his experience, he was hungry, he was thirsty, he was tired, he suffered, he was nailed to a cross. And this Walking Man makes me amazed that God, the great creator, was a walking man. When you read the Gospel of Luke, and he was on the way, and the church was called the Way because that's what Jesus was. He was on the way. And over again, so he set his face to Jerusalem. You have this walking man leaning forward with his face that it's hard to look at, but he's on the way. He doesn't stop. So, it's art liked him because he's on a big platform being, and he's vanishing into nothingness. So Sartre, being in nothingness. And there is that sense of, we would be nothing without God's breath in us. He formed us out of the dust of the ground, breathed into us the breath of life, became a living being, nefesh hayah, a walking man. Yeah, I love that piece. I always stop there and talk about it.
So when you describe your encounter with that piece, it reminds me of sitting down for a time of biblical meditation on Psalm 90, similar effect.
Exactly. That's exactly right. We are like grass, green in the morning, mowed down and withered before the evening shadows fall. 70 years given up to us. Some may even live to 80. Yeah, and yet God is always there.
Right. So Cam, you tried to unpack that piece in your chapter in the book about two sculptors. You tried to press in even deeper there. You want to comment about, just as a little taste of what the different chapters are trying to do as they engage with a given piece of art? Can you say a little bit about your grappling with Giacometti's sculpture in your chapter?
Yes, in my chapter, I wrote about Alberto Giacometti and Constantine Bancusi, both important modernist sculptors. And one of the things I wanted to find out about these sculptors is just, did they have any kind of religious background? And Giacometti actually was raised in a Reformed Christian home and actually went to seminary as a young man. And his mother was very devout, but as he grew older, he was having different kinds of experiences, some mystical experiences that moved him away, but he was wrestling with the question of his own humanity and the nature of humanness generally all along, and wrestled he did when he worked. So the Giacometti sculptures are of real interest to me. And an interesting footnote is that an early book that influenced me, published in 1973, also by InterVarsity Press, called Art and the Bible. It was written by Francis Schaeffer. On the cover of that book is an image of a Giacometti work. On the original cover, Giacometti's Three Men Walking. So there's a sculpture that Giacometti created in 1948, almost 73 years ago now. I read the book when I was 20, so not quite 50 years ago. And this is what it says on the inside of the book. Much modern art, like a Giacometti sculpture, portrays man in alienation, loneliness, despair. Was art always like this? Must it always focus on the lostness of man, is the question. That's quoting Francis Schaeffer. So I have an interesting relationship with this book because as a 20-year-old, an undergrad, this book was great news to me. Here's a serious Christian thinker engaging modern art. The part about it I don't like so much is that the sculpture is for Schaeffer an illustration of the lostness of humankind, lostness of man, he would have said. And I prefer the much more filled out interpretation Walter just gave us. No, this is what it means to be human. This is a picture of our humanity, whether we're followers of God or not. And, you know, have to appreciate the way these sculptures are made. They're made out of clay, out of wet dust, right? And then they're all modeled and molded and put together and dried. And then some of them are in plaster also, many of them in plaster, and then some of them cast in bronze later on, right? So very fragile pieces until they're cast in bronze themselves.
Great. So this is a book that is written by experts in art, practitioners or scholars of the arts, that takes a deep and thorough look at pieces in the modern wing of well-known modern artists. Not everybody is drawn to visual art or not necessarily frequent visitors to art museums. So my first question for either of you, maybe briefly, is would you encourage most of us, all of us, to make some kind of engagement with visual art part of our lives? Of course, we're awash in images all the time, you know, through the media. But in terms of art that could be put on a wall or a pedestal, the art we find in museums, would you say, that's just for a certain minority of people, or would you make any case that everybody would benefit by engaging with art to some degree?
I think more today than ever, and we live in a time of image, as you say. Yes, that's how things are communicated. And to communicate, to understand, to interact with people today, my grandsons, I need to look at images. I need to understand them. In my place where I see this happening, many places, but Paul is in Athens, and he says in his Areopagus speech, I was walking through your city and I see what religious people you are, and I carefully studied your objects of worship, and I found an altar to the agnostheo, the unknown God, and I tell you about him. That's where Paul began, looking at the images, studying them carefully, he says. And I do think that we are called to do that. I do appreciate, I was in at Wheaton College when Francis Schaeffer gave his lectures, The God Who Is There, and I was blown away by them. And came along a journey, as Cam has described, where as much as I appreciate him, rather than seeing these images as simply a statement of the lostness and the despair of our present age, I also see them connecting to where people really are. What are they saying about the human life that I share, that I also experience loneliness and frailty and vulnerability? So they speak to me in that way. And I have 7 grandsons. I don't know how I'd talk to them if I didn't study art, if I didn't communicate to them about art. And I could go on. And these images, at least in our church, Fourth Presbyterian Church, the study of these images became the most in-demand course we had at the church, because people want to understand what's going on here. Of course, people go to the Impressionist wing and Renaissance wing, and Rembrandt is my all-time favorite, great artist. But to communicate today, I'm not sure taking people to see Renoir or Rembrandt is going to be the best way to communicate. And I do long to communicate the great God creator who made us out of dust. And so for me, yes, studying images is essential to life and witness.
You want to add to that, Cam, briefly?
My answer is very brief. At least on my screen, Bobby, you're on my left and Walter's on my right. So I'm sitting between 2 collectors of my work. So I think, what can I say? Yes, you should love art. 2 appreciative collectors.
There you go. Well, I appreciated this book because to me, it's a pretty significant exercise in what we sometimes refer to as integration of faith and thought, or in Graduate Faculty Ministries, they talk about integration of faith, learning, and practice, because the people writing in the book are trying to bring their theological frame together with their art knowledge and practice frame, and think about what they have to do with one another. What does the church on one side of the river and what happens there have to do with the museum and what's displayed there and the artistic creativity that produced it in its historical context? What do they have to do with each other? This idea of relating our faith to all of life in a really thoughtful way. So Cam, in what way do you see this book as an exemplar of that kind of endeavor, which I think those of us who are in the academic world are called to?
Well, if we start out, as we did with Walter, and talk about, well, what possible relationship could what he was experiencing on Sunday morning have to what he was experiencing on Sunday afternoon, we start to enter into the question of what kind of work our cultural institutions and our educational institutions, our schools of research, our public institution, what kind of cultural work are we all doing? And then inside of that, is there some wisdom to be found in the middle of it? And I think when we start asking that question, what kind of cultural work are we doing, whether we're in the sciences, humanities, professions, ministry people, however you think, then we start to understand what kind of conversations are being held. And we live in a pluralist society right now. So that's now normative for us. We live in a culture with other people who believe all kinds of different things. And so for me, the question then really is, well, how do I understand who my neighbor is anyhow? And how can I understand them if I'm not paying attention to what's happening in these institutions? And for me, including the museum. And it's not just, well, how do I understand him or her, but Jesus had something to say about our neighbors, which is that we are to love them. And we can't really come to love people that we don't know anything about or understand. So there's a lot of layers to this. But to me, it doesn't feel like a heavy burden. It feels absolutely fascinating to understand what's happening in these various places and what is in the mind and the heart of people who are making and leading and creating, and just trying to be in touch. So that to me is intriguing and not a heavy weight.
And I would say reading the book, and congratulations again for putting it together, the original series and editing it. The writers are doing some really great work, and they're modeling engagement, they're modeling scholarship and intellectual thought, they're exercising creativity and really writing gifts. It's a kind of, some of the chapters are really quite a tour de force of imaginative engagement with the artist and art making as a whole field. Walter, I'd like to enlarge this out one more kind of layer out. And as a theologian and a biblical scholar, obviously you're in that sphere where we're trying to understand what's true about God, or true about what God has to say about us and our world. So you're immersed in that world in ways that would help us who read the Bible and try to understand and apply it, do that better. But why is it important, even as with the scriptures and theology, that we have to be engaging all of the world, history, philosophy, art, social realities, popular culture, in order to form our fullest understanding of God, ourselves, and the world? Can we just do it in the theological cloister, or do we need to be engaged with everything that's happening in the world and culture, in your view?
I enjoy reading my Greek New Testament, my Hebrew Bible, Bereshit bara Elohim. That's a pleasure to me. I enjoy reading theology. That's part of, bedtime reading. It's just how I'm made. But I don't find much a link there with my neighbor or my neighbors or people I mix with in all kinds of walk. When I go down to the university club across from the Art Institute and meet with people there, have dinners and so on, I'm not going to quote Greek and Hebrew or tell them what I read in my latest Robert Jensen book or whatever. So I need a bridge. I need somewhere to start with them. And I find that a lot of people are very interested in art and music and opera and so on. That's the kind of world I mix in Chicago. And but then that's a pleasure as well. And I want to understand, Kem says it so well, I want to understand who these people are and how they think. And I think that we too often dismiss what people are saying through art. I mean, if you could hold up the image of Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe, Andy Warhol is famous for his iconic, there we go. And so that's an icon. That's an icon. He puts these up, says, so what is your object of worship? Who are you worshiping? Who do people worship today? The last 2 years of his life, all Andy Warhol painted was Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And when he died, they took a photo of his studio, and he had up on the wall that you look into his studio 2 images of Jesus in blue and red, one blessing the elements and one reaching out to you. What's happening there? Who is Andy Warhol? What's going on in his life? I find that amazing to see that kind of art. I see the art of Salvador Dali and his celebration of the Last Supper. We don't have the modern wing, it's a National Gallery modern wing. But it's a great image of Catholic faith if you look at it. You said, Bobby, to make this integration, that you said the word thinking 3 or 4 times. What happens with art so often is it's so quickly dismissed. I like that. Oh, that's nice. They say that people walking through a gallery usually spend an average about 15 seconds per piece. I mean, they walk, they don't stop. And to understand art, it takes time, lots of thinking to make this integration to what people are saying in art. And to me, that's been one of the great adventures, discovery trips of my life. And this book represents a lot what I learned in this life too, of of taking time to really understand. Bruce Herman says, to understand, you've got to stand under. And I think that's the thing. You can't come judgmental and say, wow, that's obviously a very lost man, or that's a very confused man, or, you know, somebody's really messed up there, you know, right? Andy Warhol's a very strange man, but what is he seeking?
Right.
What, after all, is his faith? And what is he saying to us through these icons? He grew up in a Byzantine Catholic with an iconostasis in front of him all his childhood growing up. What he puts in front of us is an iconostasis. What do you worship?
Right.
What are your objects of worship? So to make this integration takes a lot of thinking, a lot of time. And I think that's what this book offers, is take some time to think about this.
It's great. Well, speaking of the book, we want to tell you all listening how you can get the book. So I think Bob's going to put an image up and put in the chat a link, but the book is available. There you go, 40% off. There's a code there. You'll also see on the right-hand side commentary on Galatians by Dr. Hansen, and Cam's first book, The Faithful Artist. So we would encourage you to take advantage of the book itself. Just to comment on your point, Walter, it seems to me that various fields, various aspects of culture are giving us the questions that we need to be grappling with as we think through our faith in an ongoing way. And I found this to be a book that it just opened doors to understand not just the modern art, but the questions that it raised in its time, which then kind of begs, what are the questions being raised in our time? And I would say especially in this pandemic period with layers of crisis on it, like what are the questions coming to us from society, from the arts, from thinkers and writers that take us into a new phase of dialogue around what is true, good, beautiful, and just. So I think, let me encourage those of you listening, or if you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat and we'll let Cam and Walter respond to them. I don't think there were any entered in yet. And honestly, if you want to unmute and just ask your question verbally, that would be okay as well. So while we're waiting to see for the curiosity to bubble up, okay, here we go. Hannah Eagleson, could you describe a few more individual pieces of art that you've found spiritually meaningful? Maybe we can pick one of the ones featured in the book by one of the writers. Cam, what comes to your mind?
Oh, well, I really am taken by Makoto Fujimura's writing about Mark Rothko and the kind of mesmerizing effect that many people have had, that Mako writes about, actually just taking time to sit in front of a Rothko painting. And I don't think this quotation is actually in Mako's chapter, but Rothko once said about his work that if in viewing his work, you were having a profound experience and found yourself weeping in front of one of his paintings, if you found yourself in that state of being after spending time with his painting, he said, then you are having the very same experience that he had when he painted the painting. And that's just really something to consider, isn't it? Is it possible that these feathered fields of color and these rectangular shapes kind of laid carefully on top of one another could evoke that kind of primal human experience of attempting to draw near to God, which Rothko claimed that he was trying to do?
Right.
I don't know if you can see this, but the
Yeah.
Chagall's White Crucifixion is overwhelming to me. It's so captivating. It's a portrayal of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which is written over the top of the cross. And Jesus there is portrayed as the Jew suffering for the Jewish people, or in his own crucifixion, embodying what the Jewish people suffer. So on the one hand, you see the Russian pogroms burning the homes. On the other hand, you see the Nazis invading the synagogues. It was done in Kristallnacht when the Jewish people's houses and homes and synagogues were smashed, the move by the Nazis. And it's just filled with images, and it's not a Christian piece of art, and yet it is, because we say yes to that. We say, yes, that's my Jesus. He did suffer for his people, and he suffered for me, and that's what it's all about. That's what the cross is all about. So Chagall's White Crucifixion is amazing image. It's I took some people there to see it, and it was gone. So where is it? Well, it's over in Florence because it's Pope Francis's favorite piece of art, and they took it over there so he could have a private viewing of it. So we've been having it almost for a whole year.
When you're the Pope.
Right. Well, I can understand what's a favorite piece, and it's right there in the modern wing. So
Here's another question. Cam, I'll kick this to you. Hans Ruckmacher once said, art must never be used to show the validity of Christianity. Rather, the validity of art should be shown through Christianity. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Shout out to Terry Gustafson. Hi, Terry. I think what Ruckmacher is getting after here is that he's wanting us to resist using art as an apologetic for Christian faith. So to simply illustrate Christianity. Now, there's an awful lot of really significant art in the world that powerfully tells the biblical story, right? So I don't think we want to write that off, but rather, I think, if I'm hearing Ruckmacher correctly here, I think he's saying Christianity is an apologetic for art. And it goes back to the kind of core themes that we've been talking about. What does the gospel tell us about? Well, in Madeleine L'Engle's words, it tells us about the glory and the tragedy of being human. And Madeleine L'Engle says in her book, Walking on Water, that for her, Christianity and art are about the same thing. They are about exploring that, the glory of being human and the tragedy of being human at the same time. I think when art is used in a kind of as propaganda, I think we get into dangerous territory. So I much more like the idea here that I think Ruckmacher is getting after.
Well, and I think at least a theistic worldview underpins art, because art is a grasping for meaning and beauty and truth and significance, and in a world that is purely materialistic and scientific, in which denies any spirituality and all concepts such as justice, beauty, personhood, are just mere constructs by beings that are just mere mechanical, biological entities, then what's the point of art, right? So I think that a theistic worldview underwrites the meaningfulness of art.
Andy Crouch has written this book a while back called Culture Making, and another distinction we could make here in an age that where consumer culture dominates, which in many ways is a very passive kind of activity. Culture making, or the making of things, is a constructive, very active engagement, very conscious and active engagement with the world. It's one of the reasons I think we need artists working in all the fields right now, is to actively, consciously, thoughtfully engage the world and not just be caught up in the predominantly consumer culture.
In the first chapter of the Bible, of course, all we see about God is God making. And then when we read that God made man and woman in his image, we have to ask, so what does that mean? Well, look at the first chapter. To be made in his image is to be a maker. And so when I go into any wing of the Art Institute, and the modern wing, I think, what do I see here about makers? What are these makers making? How do they reveal the image, being made in the image of God? I mean, even look at the Jackson Pollock, the frenetic, splashing of paint on he's making. He is doing something called action art. Sometimes you can almost see the action happening right in front of you. And it looks almost like a kind of view of the cosmos, of the universe, you can't see it in a book because they're so huge. And so I really get impressed by that, that Jackson Pollock, made in the image of God, is a maker. Look what he's making. Look at his action,
Right.
and that, to me, I give thanks to God that he's made us to be makers.
So Gloria's question about the artist's intent compared to the viewer's interpretation. First of all, a couple of the contributors in the book talk very insightfully about how does that work, particularly over time. And so I think the book will really yield insight there. But there's a certain kind of work being done by the viewer as well. If the artist is making something of the world, the viewer is making something of the art. So Cam, can you kind of talk about what's going on in that kind of gap between intent and then the work is out there and it's not necessarily to be interpreted by the artist in her own words, and the viewer's experience of that art and interpreting it?
Well, it can feel like pretty complicated territory. And here, let me say that there are some artists working who delight in obfuscation. So they take great satisfaction in making things that aren't accessible, and they don't take on the burden of, I would say, loving their neighbor at all by caring at all, if anyone understands what they're doing. I take offense at that. I think just in real practical terms, it's about sort of meeting at the middle and a kind of hospitality from both sides. So I'll just say personally that when I show work and there's an opening and people come around and look at it, I relish those moments where I'm in a conversation with someone and they're asking questions and commenting on the things they see and gaining certain kinds of impressions. And as I listen to them talk, I hear them talking about the kinds of things that I was thinking about when I made the work. And so there's a kind of hospitality that's going on there. That doesn't mean that they entirely know what it was that caused me to make the thing that I made or how I made it, and doesn't mean that I entirely understand what they're perceiving. But I think art has that potential.
Right.
And I think the way that we reach that potential is when our musicians perform at a concert, we go and listen to them, or there's a poetry reading, we hear them read, right? Or we walk in the building of the friends that our friends design, and we talk to them about it, and we extend hospitality.
It's a great image. This will be our last question. And I think it connects Elizabeth's question. So let's say that the maker is not a believer, or it may not be really clear what their perspective or inspiration was. Can we still engage? And how do we kind of integrate with the work of someone who may or may not be a believer? And a lot of what the book does, it reveals the spiritual dimensions of the lives of artists that are not obvious by looking at the work itself immediately, to get to maybe Elizabeth's point. So maybe either one of you want to comment on how do we, if the work is, we're not be sure where the person's coming from, can we still do meaningful integrative work in response to that piece?
Well, unbelievers are nevertheless made in the image of God. And Romans 1, Paul says they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, but truth is still there. The image is still there. The being human is still there. I like Rowan Williams' understanding of art in his little book, Grace and Necessity, that he says great art, or art that lasts, is art with a plenitude of meaning that has multivalence. You never sense you can plumb the depth of meaning there. And that can be found when someone not a believer in our terms of our faith, but is still a deeply engaged human being with what life is all about, develops art that just keeps you going deeper and deeper. When it comes to interpreting art, I think, my biblical teaching background, I always text author, text, reader, author, text, reader. It's a back and forth. Who is this author? What is this text? Who are we as readers? And the same with art. I want to understand the artist, and I want to understand that piece of art. And I come here with all of my thoughts and emotions and who I am as well. And it's that interplay of artist, artwork, and me. And so interpretation is not one or the other. Deep interpretation requires somehow converging all of that, understanding who Warhol is as a person, understanding, what his painting's all about. And then I look at it and I think, oh, who am I worshiping? So take one piece of art. So, we still interact with people as real people. We honor people as real people who may not have any Christian faith at all, because we believe they're made in the image of God.
Very good. And I might add in as my last comment that in any encounter with art or ideas or the natural world or other people, there's the intent on the one side, and there's how we try to read it or understand it. And there's another element, which is the Spirit of God active, using whatever is at hand to help us gain insight or wisdom or deepen our faith. So there's an added interpretive spirit at work as well. So Bob, I think we're at time here. How do we conclude?
All right. Just a moment here. Well, we want to just first of all thank all of you for just a great conversation. This was just a wonderful conversation on art. I think the conversation and the book both leave me wanting to get to the gallery.
All right.
And we have a couple of museums in our city. Bobby's actually visited a couple of those with me, and I'm looking forward to getting back to him. So again, we want to encourage people to pick up a copy of the book, and the information about that is in the chat. I just put it in there again. And the discount is available until November 22nd at 40% off using the code GFMWeb21. Like I said, when I read the book, and again, when I've heard this conversation, I just want to get to the gallery. And I think you'll find yourself maybe reacting similarly. I hope you will. I want to tell you briefly about our next conversation. We're very excited to announce that Dan Stringer, who actually is a colleague of ours on Graduate and Faculty Ministry staff, has a book that actually released today called Struggling with Evangelicalism and What It Takes to Stay. And Dan's going to be talking about the struggles that many of us may wrestle with just all the different reasons that we might be inclined to leave, and some of the scandals and whatever, and yet some of the deep affections that many of us have in our hearts for the core values and beliefs of evangelicalism. And Dan is going to be joining us for that conversation. You can register for it at tinyurl.com/Dan Stringer, and that is open as we speak. Finally, we just want to go ahead and close and say thank you all for joining us today. We want to thank Bobby for moderating, for Walt and Cam for just a great discussion. We do invite you to join the Emerging Scholars Network. If you are not already a member, you can go to our blog.emergingscholars.org, and there's a join button right at the top of the page, brief form to fill out, and you'll get newsletters that communicate all of the events that ESN is hosting. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at ESN IVCF. And this conversation and about 20 other conversations that we've done since July of last year are available on our YouTube channel at tinyurl/ESN YouTube. And we'd encourage you not only to visit, but to subscribe as well, and set up notifications so whenever a new video goes up, that's available to you. So with that, we'll conclude our conversation. And I should also mention, I want to thank InterVarsity Press. InterVarsity Press has been a real partner in these conversations and arranging for our authors to appear, and providing book discounts and other publicity materials. And so we are grateful for their support. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and have a great evening. And we will stop the recording in a moment, but we will leave the room open for a little bit if anybody wants to chat informally.